Okay, shall I begin?
Yes.
Okay, welcome to the next seminar in the series of anti-Semitism in East and Southeast Asia. For this session, we are delighted to welcome Professor Yakov Zinberg. Professor Zinberg graduated from Leningrad, currently St. Petersburg State University, Department of Oriental Studies, and Princeton University, East Asian Studies Department Graduate School, specializing in Japanese studies. Professor Zinberg has resided in Japan since 1983, engaging in academic work. After 10 years of teaching at Hokkaido University in Sapporo since 1995, Professor Zinberg for over 15 years served as professor and senior research fellow at Kokushikan University School of Asia, located in Tokyo. An expert on Japan's multiple territorial issues from October 2018 through March 2022, Professor Zinberg served as a contributing scholar for the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science research project devoted to examining the issue of Jewish refugees' transit through Japan during World War II. And Professor Zinberg will now speak for around 30 minutes on the topic Rivalry over the Jewish question amidst East Asian history wars, Japan's offense and defense. And if you have any questions throughout, you're welcome to type them in the chat. And then after the talk, we'll be able to have a discussion with Professor Zinberg. So thank you very much. Do begin.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for inviting me. I will start right away.
Are you able to begin, Professor?
Yeah, I'm sorry, it just took a little bit of time.
No problem.
History was running through Northeast Asia for over 2 decades now, involving 2 major regional allies of the United States, South Korea and Japan, and the People's Republic of China, North Korea and Russia, have mainly focused on many unresolved World War II issues. Explosive political too, the history wars have continuously caused damage to regional and worldwide security. Misconceptions, willful manipulations, and revisionist thinking have made up a clearly observable picture which continues to evolve and at times threatening to obstruct the very basics of international and domestic order formations. The last decade has brought about incorporation into the regional history wars framework of several Jewish historical memory issues, with a particular emphasis on Jewish refugees' transit through Japan in the late 1930s, early 1940s. In this regard, the trilateral alliance between Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan may not but attract critical attention. In particular, Japan's policy of utilizing the Jews, which aspired to gain profit and strategic advantages by means of exploiting the refugees' flight eastwards, deserves a meticulous examination. However, the latter policy has not resulted in Jewish victimhood comparable to that experienced in Europe, but on the contrary, saved thousands of Jewish lives. The presentation will focus on Japan's relevant position in general terms of raging regional history wars. It will also introduce such a recently appearing factor as the intrusion of Russia, viewed as a major Northeast Asian power, into the history wars battlefield, featuring yet another revisionist view of the pertinent Jewish issues. The presenter wishes to send a timely warning to the jury and advise to gain and retain objective historical truth, thus preempting yet another looming history theft. I'm sorry, there's some slight technical issues. It might, no, it's okay now. In order for you to gain an impression, to gain an image, the understanding of the emotional tension involved, I would return to the year 2018. At that time in New York, an exhibit devoted to liberation of the Auschwitz Nazi concentration camp, organized concentration camp by the Soviet Army, organized by the Russian Holocaust Research Center, took place at the United Nations headquarters. And it was launched personally by Sergei Lavrov, the then Russia's foreign minister, who continues to be a foreign minister today, as we know. A large number of countries, each in their own way, single out the Holocaust Memorial Day as one of the major calendar events, including Canada, Austria, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Italy. In the United Kingdom, the Holocaust Memorial Day is supported and promoted by the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, which claims that 27th of January, January is the day for everyone to remember the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust and the millions of people killed in Nazi persecution and in subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur. Well, neither Japan nor Russia hold any nationwide events related to the Holocaust Memorial Day, even though Japan had been an ally of Nazi Germany, while the former Soviet Union had lost not less than 2,700,000 lives of her citizens of Jewish descent as a result of the Nazi invasion. The two countries share a unique common memory of offering their transit visas to Jewish refugees from Poland. On the eve of the commemoration day, the then Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe paid official visit to Lithuania as a part of his European tour to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Romania, where Tune Sugihara, a celebrated Japanese diplomat who had issued over 2,000 transit visas to Jewish refugees from Poland in summer of 1940, worked. Let me change the picture, and you can see Tune Sugihara here. So where he worked in Lithuania. It was the very first visit to Lithuania of Japan's Prime Minister, while Aso Taro, the then Japan's foreign minister, had visited Lithuania earlier in May of 2006. During his visit, Foreign Minister Aso did not fail to stop at Kaunas and acquaint himself with Sugihara Memorial Museum, located on the premises of a former Japan's consulate building where Sugihara issued transit visas. Foreign Minister Aso had indicated that it was not a trivial matter to go on issuing visas despite objections of foreign ministry, quote, cautiously adding that, quote, as his successor in the ministry, I must think with pride about the fact that Sugihara's deeds are estimated highly. Similarly, former Prime Minister Abe highly appraised Sugihara's deeds during his official visit, specifically noting as follows speaking to reporters. The courageous and humanitarian action of Mr. Sugihara provides us with guidance as to how we should survive in this world where rule of law-based international order is being challenged in various forms. He worked far from Japan and in very difficult circumstances, but he had a strong belief as a Japanese diplomat and saved many Jewish people. I am really proud of him as Japanese. However, launching the exhibit in New York, Foreign Minister of Russia, Lavrov, implicating to a large extent the former Soviet Baltic republics, said that in, quote, a number of countries, including those who consider themselves to be paragons of democracy, there is a systematic course for a revision of the outcomes of the Second World War, which includes qualification of the Hitler activities and local collaborations, end of quote. On the contrary, Prime Minister Abe's political appeal expressed during the official visit was of a positive and forward-looking nature, as he reportedly stated that Japan, quote, has entered into a pact with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to boost economic and political ties with the three former Soviet republics, end of quote. Moreover, during the meeting, Prime Minister Abe and Lithuania's president at the time, Dalia Grybauskaitė, had reportedly discussed, quote, closer cooperation plans between NATO and across a whole range of fields, including cybersecurity, thus in effect alienating Japan from Russia. Foreign Minister Abe's visit alienated Japan's other close neighbors as well, with Sugihara's appraisal playing, curiously, a significant role. The news covering Prime Minister Abe's high evaluation of Sugihara's deeds spread rather widely worldwide. However, Korean and Chinese sources raised serious doubts regarding sincerity and a balanced nature of judgments involved. Liu Yaodong, a Chinese Academy of Sciences researcher, appealed to Prime Minister Abe to, quote, first clarify his standpoints on Japanese crimes in the Asian battlefield during World War II before promoting heroes of the war, end of quote. Calling Japan's military behavior during World War II militarist crimes, the Chinese researcher, in regard to Prime Minister Abe's trip, mentioned two specific instances as objects of criticism, one of them being, quote, a recent rejection of the Republic of Korea's demand for an official apology over comfort women, a euphemism for girls and women who were forcibly recruited to serve as sex slaves for Japanese soldiers during World War II. Secondly, Liu referred to Japan's application to UNESCO Memory of the World Register program filed in August 2016 by Sugihara's alleged hometown of Yaotsu, located in Gifu Prefecture, aiming at obtaining intangible cultural heritage status in order to arguably promote the diplomat's humanitarian spirit and attract more foreign tourists. According to Liu, during that same month, on the day commemorating 72nd anniversary of Japan's surrender in World War II, Prime Minister Abe, quote, still sent an offering to the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors, among others, 14 Class A war criminals of the conflict, despite calls by China and the Republic of Korea for Japan to face up to its wartime past, end of quote. Requesting that Prime Minister Abe should abandon a historical revisionist stance, Liu added that praising Sugihara does not, quote, make up for the mistakes during war, clearly hinting at a predetermined politicized treatment of Sugihara's behavior. On his part, reviewing Prime Minister Abe's visit, Seo Sung-wook, a popular Korean daily Japan office head, commented that Prime Minister Abe, quote, ironically visits Holocaust-related monuments more frequently than any other Japanese prime minister, end of quote, indicating, moreover, that, quote, it can hardly be a coincidence that Abe makes a visit when he is concerned for troubles with neighbors over historical issues, end of quote. Specifically, the author singled out December 2013, when Prime Minister Abe had visited the Yasukuni Shrine, an event which generated protests from South Korea and China, and was followed by others stopping at the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam in March of 2014. Further, according to Seo Wook, during his April 2015 visit to the United States, quote, when attention on the sex slave issue was growing worldwide, end of quote, Prime Minister Abe visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and after the summit meeting mentioned that he was, quote, deeply pained to think about the comfort women who experienced immeasurable pain and suffering as a result of victimization due to human trafficking, end of quote. Finally, the Korean author, imagining that Sugihara Chiune must have plausibly supported his position, identifies a correlation between Prime Minister Abe's stance expressed in Lithuania and a recent escalation, the time period, escalation over, quote, the thorny sex slave issue, end of quote, between South Korea and Japan, claiming that, quote, it is against humanitarianism and justice that Prime Minister Abe claims to value Sugihara's humanitarian act, end of quote, but refuses to respond adequately, quote, when it comes to the sex slave issue involving hundreds of thousands of innocent Korean women during World War II, end of quote. Mentioning specifically Japan's failed bid for a recognition of Sugihara's deeds in UNESCO Memory of the World Register, Korean news agency News One identified a double standard attitude of the Japanese government, emphasizing Japan's negative attitude towards a bid to recognize and include comfort women related materials in UNESCO's World Memory Register. Similarly, but in a wider context, Korean Daily, appearing in Japanese, criticized Japan's intention to have Sugihara materials included in the UNESCO World Memory Register as evolving against the background of Japan's resentment towards UNESCO's recognition of the Nanking massacre, comfort women issue, etc. Furthermore, in a related article appearing earlier, Oh Young-jin, the Korea Times chief editorial writer, addressing in particular the Jews at large, appeals to critically observe and sympathize with, quote, hundreds of thousands of women enslaved as sex toys for Japanese soldiers. Those women had to deal with tens or hundreds of soldiers per day, undergoing the dehumanizing process of being turned into human cesspools or portable toilets. It would be absurd to tell which pain would be worse than it is inflicted when it is inflicted on a mass scale, but by no means would the suffering of the comfort women be less painful than that of those killed in the Nazi gas chambers, end of quote. Reaching out beyond emotions and touching upon such a fundamental strategic issue as South Korea's alliance with the United States, Oh Young-jin angrily criticized the United States pressure aiming allegedly at South Korea's cooperation with Japan, quote, in what is emerging to be a trilateral alliance led by the US against expansionist China. Japan rejoiced to see the world's superpower take sides with it, feeling that its shameful history would be pigeonholed and forgotten forever. Japan has gone further, declaring that it no longer has an interest in the past and wants to foster future-oriented relationships with its victim nations. What an imposition, end of quote. It might be worth mentioning that a Jewish journalist representing a popular Israeli mass media outlet in January of 2018 expressed an opinion that, quote, there is evidence that the basic facts of Sugihara's life and life-saving deeds are increasingly manipulated by a growing cast of characters coming straight from the top, end of quote. Ironically, the Israeli author Amanda Borshel-Dunn was one of a selected Jewish journalists group members invited to generate positive PR images. She writes further, quote, recently in Japan, a multi-million-dollar tourist campaign targeted Jewish Americans and Israelis. It was initiated by the government in Sugihara's birthplace, the Gifu prefecture, in partnership with JTB, the country's largest travel company, and the Japanese Tourist Ministry. Along with 5 other Jewish journalists, I participated in a tour of the landlocked prefecture's new Sugihara Trail tourist package. The multi-stop trip explores and exploits his childhood. I will proceed further, and let us return now to the year 2015, which is very important because at that time, the then Prime Minister Abe made very important statements on his future vision for Japan and its past. And let's try to identify politicized motives in his pronouncements, again, regarding Sugihara and his activities. Considering the year 2015 alone, suffice it to recall that during his official visit to Israel in January of 2015, the then Prime Minister Abe, appealing for peace between Palestinians and Israelis and expressing his keen desire for Japan's constructive role, mentioned as a positive example Sugihara Chiuna's having, quote, responded to a call of his heart, quote, and saved 6,000 Jewish lives. Japan's information agency, JCC Corporation, reported further on January the 20th that Prime Minister Abe mentioned as well that the Japanese people had warmly welcomed Jewish refugees who arrived in Tsuruga and Kobe, and the generosity of that kind remained unchanged. It is worth recalling that the Prime Minister Abe's visit to Israel was immediately preceded by official visit to Japan of the then Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, in May of 2014, during which, according to Israeli press, quote, Japanese-Israel military intelligence cooperation in cybersecurity was at the center of bilateral defense agreements reached in Tokyo, end of quote. Specifically, quote, Netanyahu and Abe agreed that Israeli cyber specialists would visit Japan to help set up cybersecurity programs for resisting potential attacks on military infrastructure, strategic utilities, and companies. Officers of Japan's self-defense forces would also visit Israel to attend Israel Defense Forces courses on this subject, end of quote. Now, before addressing the United States Congress during his official visit to the United States, this is April of the same year, 2015, the then Prime Minister Abe, in the morning on April 27th, first visited the site of Boston Marathon bombings. In the afternoon, arriving in Washington, D.C., proceeded to visit the Lincoln Memorial and Arlington National Cemetery. After that, Prime Minister Abe chose to visit the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, commenting as follows, according to States News Service as of April 27th, 2015. Let's carefully listen to the text. Visiting the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II and the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, I am filled with a sense of solemnity. The Holocaust never again. In Israel, I expressed my determination that we must never ever let the tragedies of the Holocaust be repeated. Upon seeing the museum's exhibitions today, this determination has grown even stronger. Today, I also had a very special encounter that filled me anew with hope about the goodness of mankind. Today, I was able to meet people whose lives were saved when Chiuna Sugihara, a Japanese diplomat who served as a consul in Lithuania, issued them visas. The courageous actions of one man saved the precious lives of thousands. Moreover, there are more than a few other Japanese people who also helped the Jewish refugees who headed to Japan with Sugihara visas. There is much that I hope we can learn from their courage. Furthermore, the existence of such Japanese people in turn fills me with pride as a fellow Japanese citizen. I am filled with renewed resolve to keep such tragedies and also such acts of courage and goodness firmly embedded in our minds and not allow them to fade from our memory. Furthermore, I am determined anew that Japan must make ever more proactive contributions to the peace and stability of the world. Thank you. End of quote. Now we can hear peaceful rhetoric intensely involving Sugihara and extending far beyond the boundaries of Israel. But we can't fail to observe a strategic motive, which, much like in the case of Japanese-Israel agreements, might be assessed as a major theme of Prime Minister Abe's United States visit. As was reported by the state's news agency on April 28, 2015, ahead of the start of his meeting with President Obama in the White House, Prime Minister Abe and other top Japanese officials met in New York with US government officials, agreeing to, quote, tighten the defense alliance, end of quote, by means of substantially revising mutual defense guidelines. The news source had noted that the then US Secretary of State, John Kerry, stated after the meeting as follows, quote, today we mark the establishment of Japan's capacity to defend not just its own territory, but also the United States and other partners as needed, end of quote. The politicized top-level affirmative treatment of Sugihara's rescue operation can be fairly viewed as a considerably delayed policy if we take into consideration the fact that as far back as in time as on August the 2nd, 1968, one of Japan's major newspapers, Asahi, had reported in detail on Sugihara's having saved 4,000 Jewish lives, providing a map and photos of Sugihara and his son Nobuki, who was admitted as a student to Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Back in 1976, May 29th, yet another major Japanese newspaper, Mainichi, once again described in detail Sugihara's rescue operation, providing the text of a personal interview with Sugihara Chiune, which was conducted in Moscow on the premises of Hotel Minsk, where Sugihara reportedly resided, introducing Sugihara as director and chief representative of a Japanese trading company called Kokusai Koeki. Speaking to the journalist, Sugihara admitted that he had issued on his own accord and against instructions of Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs as many as 4,500 visas, all by himself. Considering the fact that Sugihara Chiune was actively involved in Soviet-Japanese trade, residing in Moscow since 1960 for as long as about 18 years, and reviewing the former Soviet Union's crucial role in Sugihara's rescue operation, we're becoming very interested in Russia's position. Russians' pronounced entry into the realm of Sugihara issue occurred last year and may be estimated just as apparently delayed, which testifies to the politicized nature of that decision. Obstructing the common version of Sugihara rescue operation, routinely ignoring the Soviet Union's role, Russia's involvement might include, or threat to include, provision of classified information, such as a record of interrogations conducted during the period of Sugihara's post-war internment in the Soviet Union. He was apprehended in Bucharest in 1944, or any other documents related to his business career, covering up to 18 years of residence in the former Soviet Union in Moscow. The former Soviet Union being seen as merely a predecessor state, the Russian Federation authorities might feel free enough to expose classified information collected during the Soviet period as they might find convenient. Russia might also find it desirable to insist upon the fact that Jewish refugees from Poland who had gathered in Lithuania were eligible for receiving the Soviet Union citizenship with January 1941 set up as the deadline, a confirmed and widely admitted option, which might be interpreted as testifying to the fact that Sugihara's rescue operation intended to offer assistance to those who wished to be, so to say, saved from being granted protection by the Soviet Union. We now proceed to reviewing the recent intrusion of the Russian Federation into the realm of Jewish issues in terms of history wars in general. It occurred last year on February 4th, 2021, when Maria Zakharova, the Russian Federation Foreign Ministry spokesman, made a highly peculiar, threatening statement during a regular briefing, referring to an article printed in the Jerusalem Post, a popular Israeli newspaper, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, January 27th of 2021. The article was authored jointly by Motegi Toshimitsu, the then Japan's foreign minister, and the then foreign minister of the Republic of Lithuania, Gabrielius Landsbergis. Let me show you some pictures. And here we see Sugihara visa, example of Sugihara visa, and here we can see Maria Zakharova. This picture on and proceed further. Entitled Remembering the Visas for Life, the article in the Jerusalem Post was dedicated to the activities of Chiune Sugihara. Again, I will remind you, a Japanese diplomat who is credited with issuing over 2,100 transit visas to primarily Jewish refugees from Poland in the summer of 1940. He served in Lithuania as a vice consul at Japan's consulate located in Kaunas. It was called Kovno. In 1984, Sugihara was awarded the title of Righteous Among the Nations by Israel's Yad Vashem Institute, the Holocaust Memorial, claiming that before reaching Japan, quote, the Jewish refugees had to travel thousands of miles on the Trans-Siberian Railway, end of quote. Foreign ministers of Japan and Lithuania failed to mention transit arrangements made by the Soviet Union's authorities. Besides a reference to a destination of North America, indicated as a purpose of the refugees' flight eastwards, was incorrect. Describing the contemporary international context, foreign ministers pointed out that, quote, in the summer of 1940, Lithuania was occupied by the USSR, just as many other European states were occupied by the Nazis or the USSR that summer. Concluding, the foreign ministers have proclaimed that Sugihara's legacy served as a, quote, foundation of friendship among Japan, Lithuania, and the Jewish communities. On her part, addressing the audience a week later, Maria Zakharova expressed her regret, criticizing the Jerusalem Post article's authors for exploiting a worthy occasion of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day with the alleged purpose of promoting, quote, a distorted perception, end of quote, of World War II, and accusing the Soviet Union of occupying Poland and the three Baltic countries in 1939-1940. Furthermore, Zakharova proceeded to criticize the Japanese diplomacy for, quote, allowing itself to be dragged into Lithuania's political games, which have the ultimate aim of revising the outcomes of World War II and the decisions of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, end of quote. Besides, Zakharova mentioned historical revisionism as a shared feature of Japan's and Lithuania's policies, specifying that Lithuania aimed at, quote, diverting the international community's attention from the ongoing glorification of Lithuanian collaborators and Nazi accomplices guilty of exterminating Lithuania's Jewish community over 200,000 people, end of quote. Referring to Japan's stance, Zakharova called, quote, Tokyo's historical myopia, end of quote, astonishing, specifying that, quote, during the events in Europe, Japan was openly attacking China and brutally suppressing any form of resistance, end of quote. In that context, Zakharova also mentioned, quote, suffice it to recall the Nanking massacre, end of quote. Zakharova characterized the joint article as devoted to Chiune Sugihara and praised the Japanese diplomat's behavior. In that regard, promising to, quote, certainly discuss Jewish refugees transit via Soviet Union and the role of the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs, end of quote. Zakharova claimed that, quote, selective attitude to giving the background of Chiune Sugihara's story was disturbing and even warned, quote, our colleagues from the Japanese Foreign Ministry that further solidarity with Lithuanian historical revisionism may become an irritant in our bilateral relations, end of quote. According to Zakharova, her critical comments followed those expressed by the Embassy of Russia in Japan, and she expressed that she hoped that the Jerusalem Post would make them public, which is true. In fact, on February 30th, 2021, the Jerusalem Post had indeed printed an article written by Mikhail Galuzin, Russia's ambassador to Japan. The ambassador found it meaningful that Sugihara, quote, was not met with honors upon his return home, end of quote. Galuzin even mentioned that, quote, according to some sources, he was dismissed, Sugihara was dismissed from the diplomatic service, end of quote. Concluding his article, Galuzin proceeded to urge, quote, our Japanese colleagues to approach the historic truth without bias instead of cherry-picking the pages that could be published without shame today. Galuzin's remark about Sugihara's dismissal deserves a critical comment. During Japan's National Diet Budget Committee meeting held on March 11th, 1992, the then Japan's Foreign Minister, Watanabe Michio, referring to Sugihara Chiune's status, mentioned that after issuing those visas in 1940, Sugihara worked for 7 years in Japan's consulates located in Prague, Königsberg, and Bucharest. According to Watanabe, that implied that he, quote, was not dismissed, end of quote. Moreover, Watanabe specified that in 1947, 1/3 of the foreign ministry's staff had been dismissed from service, which, according to Watanabe, meant that Sugihara was one of them with no embarrassing connotations present. On his part, Byodo Nagao, the then head of the Foreign Minister's European Affairs Bureau, added that Sugihara had received order of the sacred treasure upon completion of his service. Let us have a very brief look at the Soviet involvement in the Sugihara operation. I would like to drive your attention to a remarkable instance of bilateral cooperation between Japan and the USSR. In fact, it testifies to a determination of the Soviet side to resettle the qualified group of Jewish refugees beyond Soviet borders. The Soviet archives contain a letter dated March 28, 1941, signed by Alimov, the then Intourist, Foreign Tourism National Operator, Intourist Vice Chairman, and addressing Anastas Mikoyan, the then USSR Foreign Trade Minister. Alimov informed the minister that 135 transit Japan-bound immigrants from Lithuania were not admitted on board a Japanese ship, Amakusa Maru, on March 21st in Vladivostok, even though 98 people were Japanese transit visa holders. According to Alimov, the captain referred to a specific restriction order issued by the Japanese authorities. On March the 31st, Mikoyan addressed Vyacheslav Molotov, the then Soviet foreign minister, asking him to pressure the Japanese government to liquidate the troubled state of affairs in Vladivostok, and Mikoyan had mentioned only 98 immigrants from Lithuania. It is well worth mentioning at this point that according to David Engel, um, Holocaust scholar, well-known Holocaust scholar. And Nazi Germany, during 1940 and early 1941, Nazi Germany, quote, continued to try to help Jews leave Reich territory. Adolf Eichmann, who had supervised the central offices for Jewish immigration in Vienna and Prague, and had assumed control of a similar Reich-wide agency in October of 1939, actively assisted German Jews in using escape routes through Italy and Lithuania, and worked with Soviet and Japanese authorities in arranging for thousands of Jews to travel via the Trans-Siberian Railroad to the international settlement in Shanghai, end of quote. According to Russian archives, in Vladivostok, as of April 9, 1941, quotes, all the Japanese visa holders left for Japan with 55 people remaining, of whom 13 people have entry visas to the US and Chile, 39 to Dutch island of Curacao, 3 people to Shanghai with Chinese consulate visas. Besides, one person holds only a Japanese transit visa and another person has no visas at all, end of quote. Fortunately, the Joint Distribution Committee's archives help identify names of 50 refugees initially stranded in Vladivostok in April of 1941, who eventually reached the port of Shanghai on board a Soviet steamship, Arctica. A prominent Jewish scholar and literary figure, Yehoshua Rapoport, was one of 50 rescued refugees. Let me show you the documents. I hope you can see it here. This is one of the documents found in Joint Distribution Committee's archives. And let me continue. How much time do I have left?
We've gone over time so far, but I was finding your speech so fascinating that I allowed you to continue, of course. But please do wrap up in a few minutes.
I will try. Yes, I will.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, whether or not close to 20,000 Jews under the Japanese domination could be subjected to elimination remains unclear. Whether or not Joseph Maisinger, the butcher of Warsaw, who served as the Gestapo head based in Tokyo from April 41 to May 1945, had indeed offered an extermination plan to the Japanese authorities in Shanghai during his 1942 visit, the notorious Maisinger plan has no documented evidence. However, according to recent finding in Russian archives, a Soviet diplomat who visited Shanghai in April of 1943 reported that, quote, expulsion of the Jews turned into a priority in terms of cleansing the city from foreigners. According to the diplomat's report, 3 specific variants were under consideration. First, to place all the Jews on barges, send them off and drown in the open sea. Second, to send all the Jews to a distant uninhabited island located in the southern seas. And third, form a ghetto in Shanghai or the city's outskirts. According to the report, the Japanese Navy authorities supported the first variant. The Army Command supported the second variant, while Japan's foreign ministry was in favor of the third option. As we know, the third option had been adopted with the designated area formed on 18th of February 1943. So you see the importance of Russian archives and how those discoveries could affect the flow of history wars regarding history wars in the area of Jewish issues. You can see some pictures here, and here's the proclamation. And now I will be, it's just the final part that I'm going to introduce. So I think it will take just a few more minutes.
Thank you, Professor, but please do take just a few more minutes.
Yeah, it is very short, so it will be finished. With Russia being a powerful regional newcomer, Japan and the People's Republic of China have been the two primary opponents. China's position is summarized in a monograph printed in 2019, authored by a veteran Chinese scholar, Pang Guang. I'll show a picture later. Unfortunately, our time is limited, and I recommend listeners and viewers to study that remarkable monograph. Suppose we choose to view a delayed introduction of the Sugihara rescue operation as Japan's initial offense. In that case, the multiple current strategies might be conveniently viewed as defensive measures against the Chinese intervention into the history wars realm, covering a variety of Jewish issues. Japan responds by publishing new books on the subjects in English to attract foreign followers, also by proposing new candidates for the Righteous Among the Nations title and other measures. Japan's philo-Semitic history is rich and impressive. An early recognition of the Balfour Declaration by Japan in December of 1918. Further remaining barely examined at all, the Jewish World War I transit through Japan involved at least 2,000 war refugees. The distinct similarities with World War II transit relate to transit routes and Japanese authorities' preferential treatment. However, returning to misconceptions, willful manipulations, and revisionist thinking featuring history wars between Northeast Asian powers, I would like finally to repeat my initial warning to the jury and advise to gain and retain objective historical truth, thus preempting yet another looming history theft. And there are just a couple of pictures that I would like to show. This is the book, this is History Wars. It's a book published in Japan. And this is a book in English, introducing Sugihara Chiune. This is a picture of, this is a book about General Higuchi, who might be viewed as another candidate. And here is finally a good picture of Japanese Mount Fuji. At this point, I will end my presentation. And
thank you very, very much, Professor Yakov. Thank you for that presentation. That was fascinating. Oh, and thank you. You have your camera on again. I let you run over, so unfortunately we have little time for a discussion. But I really did want to hear the end of your presentation there. So thank you for sharing that with us. At the end, you pointed out a few books there. Were they? Can you just sort of reinstate? Were they about Sugihara? They're Japanese books about Sugihara. Is there a lot written about him in Japan? Is this sort of a popular topic now?
It is a popular topic. There's even a film, and there are many books about Sugihara, but I've noticed that some books were translated into English in order to attract foreigners and foreign support. Yes, there are very many books about Sugihara, but in fact, as I said, one of the strategies is to enlarge the number of people, related, and so the attempt to introduce other relevant personalities, which is supported by Israeli side.
Oh, that was actually one of my questions. I was going to actually ask sort of what is kind of the Israeli position as regards all of this engagement here. I mean, I'm sure that, because I see a similar parallel with Ho Fengshan, in China, as sort of a form of kind of soft power and cultural diplomacy between these two nations. Is there a similar kind of Israeli engagement in the narrative of Sugihara in this way to sort of create these good relations with Japan?
Yes, it is very similar. It is indeed similar. However, there are many, and a growing number of opponents, and an official Israeli position has been just expressed by the head of Yad Vashem, is to enlarge the number of recipients of the title.
Interesting. Your presentation in that way, sort of building off that, seemed to be generally about this sort of contestation over this narrative, about this sort of claiming of this historical narrative and the purpose of this narrative sort of in history. And I was quite fascinated by the part where you were talking about the Soviet Union and their sort of input in this kind of attempt to disrupt or discredit this narrative in some way, and then kind of Japan's attempt to sort of pull it back within that. So that bit I was fascinated about. And then you also moved on, you talked about finding more documents in the Russian archives that shed sort of more light on this at the same time as well. So this seems to be a narrative that is constantly being claimed and contested, but then is actually still developing as we find out more about it from archives and historical sources as well. So it seems to be something that is contested and is challenging and is changing over time as well.
Yes, it is indeed so. And especially now that relations between Japan and Russia are very bad, bad moment because of the events in Ukraine and Japan's support for Ukraine and so on. And so there's a chance that Russia might use this sort of card and probably disclose other documents which might, because Russia knows Sugihara very well, as I told you, for as long as 18 years, Sugihara actually lived in Moscow. And he was 60 years old when he received that job title and he moved to Moscow. So there must be quite a lot known about him, and material must be in their archives, including interrogations.
That's absolutely fascinating, actually. So it's still kind of playing a part, despite it being such an old narrative and so contested and changing so much over time. It's actually still playing a really significant part in international relations, and potentially,
yes.
Yeah, and potentially even more so, given the changing state of the world today. It sounds like you're in a very good research topic in that area, in that case, actually, because that's something I'm sure you're keeping a very close eye on. I also sort of wanted to sort of clarify this contemporary interest in Sugihara and in his narrative. Is this something that has begun from around 2018? As regards its position in sort of international relations? You seem to say 2018, and kind of you talked about Lithuania and I think it was also Latvia and Estonia, and the importance of Sugihara to these nations and to their relations with Japan. Is sort of 2018 the time when this starts to begin? The significance begins?
No, in fact, that relationship, particularly with Lithuania, started in 1991.
Oh, so much earlier.
I just wanted to show you what sort of an emotional tensions behind it. And 2018 provided some good examples of Korean reactions and Chinese reactions, just for you to have an impression of how emotionally
Sure.
What history was really mean for Koreans, Chinese. But in fact, to proceed further, what we need cooperation of scholars based in Korea, based in China. It's an extremely difficult research, and it really requires cooperation.
I completely agree. And there is actually, I mean, so much research coming out nowadays about Judaism and anti-Semitism and attitudes towards Jewish people and the Holocaust across Asia now. So this is quite an exciting area of scholarship to be in. I'm sure you agree. That was actually one of my next questions, was about the sort of the South Korean engagement in this. It sort of seemed that it was going kind of in two ways, this kind of the Korean involvement in it, because on one level it seems that the narrative of Sugihara was being used somewhat as a distraction from other atrocities, such as the comfort women issue. So it seems as though the reclaiming of the Sugihara narrative was functioning as somewhat of a distraction from other atrocities. But at the same time, you also seem to say that when the Japanese Prime Minister visited, I think it was Yad Vashem, he sort of came out of it actually saying the comfort women issue needs to be addressed. So it seemed like it was sort of having these two different effects in such a way. Can you talk a little bit about that, sort of about how that has maybe played out?
I think that sort of theme appeared also very strongly in Zaharova's threat, so to say, when she said that Lithuania, in her parlance, Lithuania was using Sugihara story as a way to hide the crimes of Nazi accomplices. So it's just the same kind of position taken by South Koreans, and by the Chinese, that is being used in order to sort of as a cover-up, as a cover-up for all sorts of military crimes, and in fact it's being used intensely, particularly at times where tensions between Japan and South Korea or China grow stronger. So, and then we can easily trace that development, and really it's true. But it does not really relate only to South Korea. It also relates, as I said, to Lithuania just as much. So that's Zaharova's accusations and positions of those Korean authors, as I mentioned, they're very similar in content.
Just to go sort of back in history a bit, when did the Japanese interest in Sugihara actually begin? And was it kind of sparked by this need to sort of reclaim an alternative history, a more benevolent history in essence? I mean, when did this sort of engagement with this man and his history begin in Japan?
As I said, it's a very delayed policy, really. Because, it started somewhere in the early 90s, and it hasn't been researched so far, but I would say that during that time period, relations between Japan and the United States were very bad. And Sugihara was used, that story was applied in order to somehow impress American publics through the press, which worked beautifully. So it really starts from around 1992, from that time period, and it worked beautifully. In Japan, there's a belief that Jews are particularly powerful in media sources, which is partly true. I think Jews are sort of present there, and that strategy was first used in early 1990s, and then continued and was used in various contexts.
I find that absolutely fascinating, in that it actually began as part of an attempt to somewhat cultivate better US-Japan relations. Because I would have instantly thought that this would have been about Israeli-Japanese relations, which a lot of it is, of course, but actually you're saying primarily this began as a part of US-Japan relations. That's quite fascinating.
And continues the same way.
Continues in Lithuania, you're saying, yes. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I find also, I do remember when I learned about the Lithuanian interest and connection with Sugihara, and being very surprised about that. In essence, it wasn't something that I was expecting. But you're also saying that this stretches to Latvia and to Lithuania as well, and continues to be an important form of diplomatic relations between Japan and these nations. And I guess we'll see how this plays out, given the changes in the global situation at the moment. Okay, we're just about out of time then. So I want to say thank you very much to Professor Yakov Zinberg. Thank you for sharing that with us. And it's an extremely understudied area, I think, and one that is quite exciting given how significant it is and given how much is changing. So I wish you all the best for your future research. And I do hope that we'll hear back from you in the future, and that you'll be able to study this in the future as well, because it's certainly much needed. So thank you very much for your time, Professor, and I'll say good night.
Yeah, good night.